All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to finish this once and for all. Part five. Sorry, we wanted to get into four parts, but here we go. International relations. We'll do this stuff quick, right? It's known as a period of isolationism or growing isolationism, with certain exceptions, of course. 1921 is the official end of the war. Congress signs a joint resolution. We never made a formal treaty, but Congress finally passes with a joint resolution ending the war. Despite isolationism, there is a major growth, however, in American presence around the world. United Fruit in Central America, and our presence in purchasing oil from the Middle East. Oil is a whole new industry. Although America was the number one producer back then, we were already starting to dabble in the Middle East a little bit. It was British, of course, at that time. We have a couple of important disarmament conferences and various treaties that we need to look at. The Five-Power Naval Treaty, 1922. This is the British and the Americans refraining from fortifying any of their holdings in the Far East. It's seen as very connected to problems later because the Japanese are not subjected to any restraints and they're allowed to build up their entrenchment, causing us all kinds of problems later on. Four-Power Treaty is another one. It replaces the Anglo-Japanese alliance. This is the UK, Japan, France, and the US, essentially preserving the status quo. This is about trying not to upset the Japanese, and in the meantime, it actually is allowing them to grow and grow into this new world power that will become a major threat. The Nine-Power Treaty has to do with China. We're not going to worry about all the different countries involved, but it's sort of supporting the open door policy in China that we've learned about earlier. My personal favorite, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, was a treaty that outlawed war. Yep, you heard me right. They made war illegal. Yay. Well, obviously it didn't really work so well, though, did it? It allowed for defensive war, which is kind of an idealistic or a slippery slope. And what does that exactly mean, and who can enforce that? But, that's what they were thinking about in 1928, is trying to get rid of war. They thought they could just legislate it away. Obviously, didn't go all that well. On top of treaties, we should also be talking briefly about tariffs. So let's talk about the Fordney-Macomber tariff. Let's make sure that we're familiar with all the various tariffs of this time period. This is an increase in tariffs. Before that, we had Wilson's Underwood tariff of 1913, which was at about 27% on foreign goods. The Fordney-Macomber brings it up to 38.5%. This is, of course, trouble for Europe because they're supposed to be paying us back for all the money we loaned them to fight during World War I, but we're blocking their trade so they can't make the money. Just another tariff to remember is the Payne-Aldrich of '09, which was another high tariff. So it's an era of high tariffs. Scandals. Harding's presidency, like Grant's, is famous for its scandals. I just threw all three of them up here at once. In 23, Colonel Forbes and the Veterans Bureau, there was a massive embezzlement scandal. Colonel Forbes was very close to the president. The Teapot Dome scandal is the big one. And then I'll mention briefly the Attorney General Doherty and his pardons and liquor permits, getting basically bribes and getting kickbacks and money for allowing these kinds of things and getting busted. The Teapot Dome, let's talk about that for a minute. This was had to do with oil. These were naval properties that were found to have a lot of oil on them, and they were sold to private businesses in return for kickbacks, right? So the guys who sold them got some money. The people who got the bribes went to jail, but actually those who bought it were acquitted, and I believe they got to keep it in the end. A little cartoon showing it. This one really does affect everybody around the president. Never directly linked to it, I will mention. But the president suddenly and mysteriously dies. The newspaper report, heart attack brought on by tainted crab. Some say murder, some said suicide because he was going to get busted or connected to these scandals, but we never know. All we know is that he dies, and Silent Calvin Coolidge becomes president. His nickname was Silent Cal. He will become president, and then he will run in 24 against Davis, and you'll see here much closer election in its own sense. The election of 24. The vote is split, however. The non-Republican vote is split between the Democrat Davis and the Progressive Party, La Follette. He only gets one state, Wisconsin. That's our old Fightin' Bob La Follette of World War I fame. And a little surge of progressivism. Look at that, 16.5%, 4.8 million votes. It's definitely one of the best third-party successes that we've ever seen, but can still only carry one state because of the nature of the Electoral College system. with his 13 votes. Anyways, like I said, it was this torn three-way race, and it had a lot to do with prohibition as well. There was this wet-dry division between the Democrats. It also had to do with immigration versus nativism. Davis, I should mention, was known to be of the House of J.P. Morgan. He was very well supported by big business. Does manage to get those 8.3 million votes. Fighting Bob called for things that he believed in back during World War I and before that, progressive issues like relief for farmers, state ownership of the railroads, supporting labor over big business. And it is really interesting to see that they almost got those 5 million votes, which at this time was the most successful third party ever. Let's talk about some of the foreign policy under Cal. This was an ad, of course, used for Davis. And it's Davis and Bryan. This is not William Jennings Bryan. It's actually his, I think it was his brother, definitely a family member. And they're reminding us of the Teapot Dome. Remember the Teapot Dome. Vote against the Republicans because they were the Teapot Dome party, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to carry it or to do it, right? Yeah, he was the younger brother of William Jennings Bryan. That brings us to Silent Cal. He was a very quiet man. He was once famous for making a bet. A lady bet him at a party that she could get him to say 3 words before the end of the party. Bet him, I think, $50, and he walked up to her at the end of the party, and he said, "You lose." 2 words. He won. That was all he said that whole night. Anyways, let's talk about his foreign policy. What's going on under Cal, right? We've got this international debt issue, right? We used to owe money in this world. We used to owe $4 billion. By the end of the war, World War I, we're owed $16 billion. Europe at this time was demanding debt forgiveness. They wanted to not have to pay us back. They felt like this was a world war, that we all did it together, that we loaned them money to fight so that we could stay out of a lot of the fighting. They lost so many people, they thought it was a humanitarian issue that we should forgive the debt. But we didn't forgive the debt. We came up with instead, on top of that too, remember all these tariffs, making it really hard for the European countries to make the extra money they needed to pay back the debt. And then they're rebuilding from a horrible war as well. The Dawes Plan was what we came up with in 1924, where we rescheduled the German reparations. Remember from the Versailles Treaty, Germany was paying all this money to Europe, and then Europe would take that money and give it to us, and then we would sort of give it back in loans to Germany. And we created this little cycle of money known as the Dawes Plan. It was a huge problem, and all of the countries in Europe ended up defaulting on their debt, except for one. Can anybody guess that country? Finland. Honest Finland was the one country that did not default on its debt. But this led to enormous ill will across Europe towards the United States. Not a good thing. We're not so happy. As a final thing I'll mention too in foreign policy, Central America, the U.S. Army will occupy the Dominican Republic, it will occupy Haiti, and will occupy Mexico. I say Army, some of that may have been the Navy as well, but you get the point. Finally, the last thing to talk about is the election of 1928. And this is Hoover, Herbert Hoover, who'd never been elected before, but he's been serving as the Secretary of Commerce and in various administrations. He's going to run on the Republican ticket, and we're going to have, as a shock actually, that Calvin Coolidge chooses not to run. And in his typical quiet way, he slips a little note to a journalist that says, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. His son had died recently, and many people said that was the main reason he didn't run. He was still quite popular. A lot of people wanted him to run. There was some speculation that he knew the economy was about to collapse, but I've never seen anything to make me believe that. Anyways, Hoover runs against Al Smith, who was a New York, he was known as Alcohol Smith. This brings us back to the old rum and Romanism Catholic from New York, very scandalous to a lot of Americans. The radio figured big. This was a radio election campaign. Hoover was helped a lot because Al had his strong New York accent. He still manages to carry that solid Democratic South in those days because they would not dare vote Republican. And he gets Massachusetts, and that's about it. Landslide election. Hoover does an excellent job. He's the first one to carry a state that had seceded. It's his first run for office. Silent Cal dies actually in 1933. I'll mention that. He doesn't live through much of the the Great Depression. We are coming to a close here of our 1920s. Hoover's the last one we'll mention. We're going to save the big crash for the 1930s, even though it's 1929. Here's our Hoover vacuum cleaner. Of course, we didn't mean that Hoover. We meant, whoops, nope, wait a minute, that's the Hoover Dam. Nope, we didn't mean that one. We meant this guy. Hoover running against Smith. Hoover, of course, as we saw, just killing him. So we can just do a quick review. 1920, 1924, and finally 1928. Right? So we went Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. The Great Depression is going to hit in 1929. We'll learn about that later. Oh, and I think I forgot to give you the answer to this question earlier, which was, of course, letter B. I do not like this question at all, I'll point out, but it's a real AP question from the past on practice tests. Thank you very much for learning about the 1920s. And as our final couple of minutes, I'm going to show you the preview. I don't know if we're allowed to do this. Hopefully I can. But I'm going to show you the preview for Iron-Jawed Angels.
Has there been any reaction from the president? Who knew about this?
The National Woman's Party will station sentinels at the White House gate from dawn until dusk every day until the Constitution of the United States is amended to ensure that every citizen, regardless of sex, is entitled to vote for the man who occupies...
Or woman.
Or woman. Who occupies that house. Give that good boy an extra cookie.
And within their legal rights.
They'll get tired of the cold. It won't last. See you, Mr. President.
How about their trespassing? On public property?
The avenue is misty gray, and here, beside the guarded gate, we hold our golden, blowing flags.
Eyes front! Eyes front!
Hunger strike. I was standing by my window on a cold and cloudy day. Quiet! When I saw that